If I were to show you the MicroProse label, what's the first title that you'd think of? Hello cave dwellers, welcome into the cave. Just a small selection of MicroProse titles here on the table from tens if not hundreds that exist in our storerooms. Such a prolific label as it was, spanning many genres. And I am of course talking about the old MicroProse, not the new owners of the brand, as it's popped up again in recent years. Founded in 1982 by Sid Meier's of Railroad Tycoon and Civilization fame, not yet invented at this point of course, and former US Air Force pilot Wild Bill Steely, I associate them with strategy and resource management games such as those by Meier's, as well as one of my favourites, Chris Sawyer's Transport Tycoon, and XCOM, the game that expanded on Laser Squad and Rebel Star before it. But what I associate with MicroProse more than anything else is The Sims, from Falcon to B-17 to Jeff Crammond's F1 GP to Gunship 2000, every one of them coming with a weighty manual, some of them with a map, some with a keyboard overlay. It was all enough to make you feel like you trained and joined the armed forces by the end of it. This was a company that dominated the industry with its distinctive logo on every shelf and in every magazine. MicroProse, an all-American success story, right? Well, yes, of course its origins are all-American, but you've only got to look on the back of any box or pamphlet, such as this one over here in the UK, to see certain addresses which crop up time and time again. And those addresses just happen to be 20 to 30 minutes away from right here in the cave. Yes, this corner of the UK is where MicroProse seemingly had its offices, and we're going to investigate that during today's episode. But as soon as I noticed that, it explained why more and more visitors to the cave, as well as the people that I share the building with downstairs, kept telling me stories about dumpster diving, or to use a more English term, bin digging. Yes, what they would do when they were younger, normally teenagers in their stories, was go to MicroProse's offices, go around the back, jump in the great big wheelie bins, and dig out floppy disks. Floppy disks, which I'm told anecdotally had sometimes demos, sometimes rolled in retail demos to put into shops, and sometimes beta versions of games. But that's not what they were doing it for, of course. They were just looking for a cheap and ready supply of floppy disks so that they could carry out their filthy piracy using them. Something that I would never partake in, of course. So when a recent visitor turned up with these at the cave, I can't say that I was surprised having heard all of these stories, but I was surprised and delighted to hear that he told me they'd never been repurposed, they'd never been formatted, and the contents on them should be exactly as they were when they came out of the doors of MicroProse. And with it comes many questions. What's on these discs? Are they still readable? Have they rotten away? Are its contents the same as the retail versions of what's written on the labels here? Or have we got something rare, unusual, perhaps never seen by the public? And how can we archive that off safely so that I can share it with you so that you can have a look? Well, we're going to answer those questions today, I hope. And we'll maybe learn a little bit more about the UK arm of MicroProse as we go along. And we're going to jump in the car as well and take a look at some of those locations as they're so nearby and see if we can spot any traces of MicroProse of the past or just what those locations are doing in the modern day. Maybe we can find the bins where people used to dig around and find these discs. Lots to do today, but let's start by going through these discs and we'll see what we've got to work with. And that's the content you're here for, isn't it? To watch me drive you places and look at bins. That is some top quality YouTube content. We'd like to thank PCBWay.com for supporting our episode today. They aren't just about PCBs, although they do a tremendous job of that. They also offer CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, 3D printing, and injection molding. If you're creating, then PCBWay.com can help you bring your project to life. Get an instant quote now over at PCBWay.com, and we thank them for their support. Right, so let's see what we've got in the box then. I'm as excited as you to see what we've got in here. So let's just go through them one by one, see what we're dealing with. Okay, on top of the pile, a familiar name, UFO for the Amiga 500. Now UFO was a fantastic game on the PC. It was probably pretty good on an accelerated Amiga, maybe a 1200, and certainly with a hard disk. I'm sure you could have had some fun with it. I'm just amazed that they ever made it for the stock 500 because it was a turn-based strategy game, and the Amiga 500 just didn't have the power. You could wait an age for the enemy to calculate their turn. And it says Geoscape on the label here. We've got disc 1 and disc 2. Geoscape wasn't a version of UFO, it was a part of the game. It was that section of the game where you had the globe and you could pick where your base was and build your base. So that explains why on these next discs here, I can see that we've got Tactical Disc 1 and 2, and that was the isometric view where you had the actual fighting that took place, akin to, oh, all right, it wasn't isometric, but I mentioned earlier Laser Squad and Rebel Star, very similar type of game. UFO expanded on that idea. So these discs, I think, are part of the same set of discs for the game, and I'm pretty sure there were more discs for the game. Maybe we'll find them in the stack. The next disc is far more exciting. Look at this. It's got the words pre-production sample for a really familiar game, Rick Dangerous, on the Atari ST. It's dated 15th of June 1989, and pre-production sample suggests that it's a work in progress or perhaps a snapshot of development at the time on the date that's on the disc there. Given that the One magazine reviewed this game in July, the following month of 89, I would suggest that this is either very nearly complete or, as it says, master at the top of the disc there, complete. This may well have been one of the discs that went away for duplication to create the final product. So that's an exciting one. Oh, we've got another pre-production sample next. This one says Tower of Babel for the Atari ST, dated 18th of the 12th, 1989. And this game was released under the Rainbird label. It wouldn't have had MicroProse on the front of the box. And just like Rick Dangerous, which we saw just a moment ago, that had the Firebird label on it, and that was developed by Core Design. It wasn't developed by MicroProse. So MicroProse bought Telecomsoft from British Telecom in 1989, and that's the label that they used, so they carried on using that Firebird and Rainbird brand for third-party developers. At the bottom of the box there, the very same address, Unit 1, Hampton Road Industrial Estate, Tetbury in Gloucestershire, which is the same address we saw on the back of those other MicroProse boxes, so that just confirms that it came from the same place. And just like Rick Dangerous, the date on this disc is very close to when it came out. It was reviewed in December of 89 and January of 1990 in magazines, so as there's a December date on this, must be pretty much complete. Our next disc, well, it says Gunship 2000 disc. There's no disc number, and I know for a fact that Gunship 2000 was more than one disc. It doesn't say pre-production or anything like that, but the funny thing about it for me is that it looks like MicroProse have been digging through their own bins and recycling their own discs, because you can see this was originally a retail copy of F19, and they've just enabled it, stuck a label over it and repurposed it for whatever that is on there. Maybe we'll find out, maybe we won't, but we'll certainly give it a try and we'll image it. Our next disc is Tower of Babel again, but it has underlined many times, not a game master, retail demo only. So this was designed to go in shop windows, promote the game, and encourage people to buy copies of it in the hope that they were impressed by what they saw. Another disc now, this is interesting. It is a MicroProse game, F-15 Strike Eagle for the IBM. And this disc doesn't say pre-production, it says customer evaluation. Handwritten on the disc, there is a date, it says 1st of the 1st, 1989. But more interesting at the top, it says ZMAG/Dyson. ZMAG was a company that provided disk duplication and copy protection services, not just for gaming, but for the software industry as a whole. And they came about because of a chap called Bob Moody, who used to work for Osborne Computing, Osborne of the luggable computer fame and other things besides, of course. When they went bust, he moved to Dyson and set up a software publishing division. Dyson with an A, not with an O, so they're nothing to do with the hand dryers or the vacuum cleaners. It's a totally different Dyson. And what happened here was they tried to create a 3¼ inch standard floppy disk. They pumped a lot of money into trying to create this and making it the industry standard. It didn't happen. The 3½ inch floppy disk took off instead, and it cost them a huge amount of money. And a company called Zydex then swooped in, bought up Dyson, and then merged their own ZMAG disk duplication services with Dyson's duplication services. And what it tells us is that MicroProse were using these guys to duplicate their disks to get the retail versions into our hands. So it's a really nice snippet of information there. When it comes to copy protection, my overriding memory of MicroProse products is having to get the thick manual out and look up page number, a paragraph and a word and type that into the screen, rather than any kind of fancy copy protection on the disk, laser burning or wide tracks or any of that, all of which ZMAG could provide. But then why would I know about any of that? I always bought the retail version and didn't pirate them. Speaking of pirates, our next disc is Pirates. Who doesn't know about Pirates? That wonderful Sid Meier's game. I think we've probably all played it. And this one is labelled XDS with a part number at the top, customer MicroProse. So this was produced externally, not, well, I mean, why would MicroProse put customer MicroProse on their own discs? Obviously the customer of this duplication or production service. And then it says dupe, DUP 11401.F and DRV, perhaps drive 73301. I don't know the significance of those two things on there, but if you happen to have a history in disk duplication in the 80s and 90s and can fill in the blanks for us, please do leave a comment and I'll be happy to pin it to the top for others to learn from. Another pre-production sample, oh, what a good one this is, Stunt Car Racer. Again, it says customer MicroProse and it's dated 14th of December 1989. It's a stunning game by Jeff Crammond, who later would go on to do F1 GP and before that did Revs and various other games. I've grabbed a retail copy of it here. Stunt Car Racer for the Atari ST, this version is. And you'll notice it doesn't say MicroProse on the front, it says Micro Style. Now that was a sub-brand that MicroProse used. Turn the box around, you can see it says MicroProse on the top. In the US it was called MicroPlay. Over here it was Micro Style, and that was just another brand that they used for third-party developers, so any games that they hadn't developed in-house. If I slip it open here, it's got MicroProse all over the box. And there's something fun in this box. If we open it right up, we've actually got a 1990 MicroProse catalogue in here, which folds out like a great big poster. And you can see on there all of the games from the time. You can see the MicroProse label, the Firebird label, the Rainbird label, and also that Micro Style label. All kinds of games which just give you an idea of what MicroProse were up to over here. Stunt Car Racer came out in 1989 and the pre-production sample is dated December 89. So again, that's got to be the finished version, if not very close to the finished version. Next on the pile, another pre-production sample. Oh, Gunship. This is perhaps the earliest disc we've seen so far. It's labelled 1988. Came out in 87 elsewhere, but 88 in this region. The logo at the top, Reflex. I've just done some digging on my laptop to find out who that is. It turns out it's Reflex Magnetics Limited, and they manufactured floppy disks, and we can see an advert here where it says that they wanted to create the highest quality, most reliable diskette ever made. So what better way to put that claim to the test than try it 35 years later and see if the disk is still readable. I'm pretty sure they offered duplication services. I haven't seen anything to actually confirm this, so maybe, again, if you're out there and you can remember or you worked for them, do let us know. But I'm guessing they didn't only provide blank floppy disks, they also provided duplication services, judging by the label. What is this? Pirates Gold CD32. So we've got Pirates again. Good grief. The Commodore CD32 flopped, and a large part of that was because we perceived it to have many lazy ports of games that were already available on floppy disk for our Amigas, which had come out in some cases years before, and here was a new cutting-edge console with games on CD, which, well, we could tell they were just games that had been taken from floppy disk and maybe had a full motion video intro added to it, if that. So to see a game being developed for the platform on floppy disk just kind of confirms all of those things and tells us that we were right to hate on the system for getting those lazy ports. Yeah, it's dated 8th of December 1993, but this one also has a timestamp on it. It says 11:13 AM. I found one review for this in January of the following year, and then the other reviews were in February and in March. So given that this is timestamped, that does make me think that this was something to do with playtesting, and it was just to let the person know exactly what version they were trying, and just check their disks and make sure that they weren't testing the wrong version, and perhaps even an updated version came out the very same day. Maybe that afternoon they had more to test. So that's interesting, but it just says disc 1, which suggests that there were other discs, and I can't see any other discs for Pirates Gold, but we'll try and image it anyway and see if it does anything. Next up, Fields of Glory for the A500, disc 1 and disc 2 here. 29th of September 1994. It's not a particularly well remembered or reviewed game, so I don't think many people hold Fields of Glory close to their heart. The earliest reviews I can see are December 94 though, so that does suggest that this could be an earlier version with a September date on there. So we will image it and look into that and see if it works. We're nearly at the bottom of the pile now. Next we've got 2 more discs for Impossible Mission A500. Handwritten, it says pre-production on this, or pre-prod. 18th of May 1994, and its full title was Impossible Mission 2025. It celebrated 20 years since the 8-bit version of Impossible Mission. Lots of people played that. It enhanced the graphics, of course, on the 16-bit platform. It didn't review particularly well, and its release date seemed to slide. So in Edge magazine, originally it was set for November of 1993, I found, and then it slipped to April of 93 before eventually coming out in May of 94, this is dated May of 94. So again, I think this is pretty close to the release date and probably a fairly complete game. The last two discs actually bring us, looks like, back around to where we started, more UFO discs. This time it has the actual title of the game, UFO Enemy Unknown, dated September 1994, discs 1 and 2. So that's going to go with the other 4 discs which we saw earlier to, I hope, complete the set. That's a really interesting pile of discs. It spans 7 or 8 years of MicroProse's life here in the UK over various platforms. I think the chances of success for us capturing these, they don't seem too bad because I'm not seeing any mold on the label. I'm not seeing that they've been stored in terrible conditions, but we can't see what's going on the inside. So I'm going to make an attempt now to capture all of these. I will talk you through the system that I'm using, which I've got set up over here. But before we do that, as David Hasselhoff once said, jump in my car, let's go and visit those old MicroProse locations and see exactly what they are, if they still exist, and get a feel for where MicroProse was based and why the hell they chose this part of the world to base their UK offices. Our first stop is Tetbury Town Centre, which is a 15-minute drive south of the cave, and the countryside is just bursting into life as summer approaches and the nice weather is finally here. Tetbury was apparently founded in the year 681 and it became a market town, doing lots of trade in wool, which is reflected in their annual wool sack races, in which locals race each other up and down a hill carrying a 27-kilogram sack of wool, because that's what we do for fun in the Shires. The story of how MicroProse came to be here goes that the chap who set up the UK arm of MicroProse advised investors that Tetbury is the upcoming new Silicon Valley of England, the game development capital. They all nodded their heads and it was set up. It later transpired that he lived in the town and he simply didn't want to move away. So that's why he spanned that story, and that's how MicroProse ended up here. This yellow building is the Market House, built in 1655 in the centre of the town. And once I've parked up, it's here that I'm hunting for those old offices. The town also boasts a church built in 1781, and this statue of what looks like Shaun the Sheep in knitwear. The first address on the box that I'm looking for is 2 Market Place, and that's this street here, tucked behind the Market House. But as it's such a nice building, I went around the front, and then we can duck under it here, and underneath here amongst these pillars is where the old wool markets would have taken place. But the building I'm looking for is number 2, which I found is now the Cotswold Dogs and Cats Home charity shop. I'm told this building wasn't just an office, it was a shop, a MicroProse fronted and branded shop stocked with all of their games. It wasn't a general computer game shop, it was only the MicroProse published games that were in there. Sounds like my dream shop with all those flight sims that would have been in there. There was also a model shop which sold computer games, so for anything else you would have gone there, and honestly, the model shop was the stuff of legend. It's where everyone went to buy their video games, or at least Tetbury gamers of a certain vintage. But for MicroProse, this was the place to come. Ooh, £10, that's not bad. But it hardly looks like the place from which you distribute thousands of video games, so what's going on here? Well, that brings us on to our second address, the next one that I found on the back of a box. It's in the same town as Tetbury and it's a 2-minute drive away on the outskirts, so let's back away from the glitter ball and head out there. This is Unit 1 Hampton Road Industrial Estate, and as I turn the corner, there it is. The offices as they were in the early 90s, with the MicroProse logo on the side of the building. This looks far better suited to the size of business that they were, with offices and lots of warehouse space for products. There's a truck-sized door on the side, which you could load up and drive away with hundreds of games, and today it doesn't look so different. This is the place everyone tells me they would steal their floppy disks from. I'm not quite sure where the bins would have been, around the back probably, but on the flip side I'm told by an ex-employee who happened to come to the cave last weekend and we got chatting about this. He said they would often hammer a nail through the disk before disposing of them to try and discourage this disk theft behaviour. The kids were just getting away with it as and when they could. It now seems to be home to SES or Survival Equipment Services. I wonder if they know what magic used to happen in there. And amazingly, while browsing YouTube, I came across an old VHS rip of the inside of these offices, a clip which you can see on the screen here now. It gives you an idea of what it would have looked like inside and who was working in there. And if you want to see more of that, I've added a link in the description so you can go and watch the full video and take the tour. It was very satisfying to find this building and to recognise it from old pictures and identify it as MicroProse. I couldn't find any old pictures of the shop in the town centre, unfortunately, so if anyone out there has got one, please do let me know. There's one more location that I wanted to check out while I was out and about, and that's another 30 minutes drive south to the town of Chipping Sodbury, the address of which started appearing on boxes in the mid-90s after MicroProse merged with Spectrum Holobyte. That happened in 1993, and by 1994 competitor Psygnosis set up an office in neighbouring Stroud with the purpose of poaching talented MicroProse staff. So in a funny way, bringing the talent to Tetbury was starting to create this software and gaming development ecosystem that had been made up in the first place. It was becoming a self-fulfilling lie. This large building here was MicroProse head office in Chipping Sodbury. They also had some satellite offices in the north of the country, I understand, which were closed down as part of the takeovers. This area used to be the site of a mansion and some pleasure gardens. That's how it's labelled on maps in 1824, but then in the 1960s it was falling into disrepair, it was boarded up and it was demolished to create this modern building. By 1998, MicroProse were taken over by Hasbro Interactive, who in turn were taken over by Infogrames, who phased out the name and would close down the offices. I'm told in later years there was also a satellite development office another 40 minutes down the road in Chippenham, which also would be shut down by Infogrames in the early 2000s. So there we have it, a nice drive about. If you ever wondered what MicroProse offices in the UK looked like, now we've seen some of them, we know where the addresses were on the backs of the boxes, and it's from one of these places that those discs would have come from. Speaking of which, let's get back to those discs and see if we can archive and test them. My weapon of choice today is the Grease Weazle. It's readily available and can be picked up for well under £30. I mean, £30 is the top end when it comes to eBay prices. You should be paying less than that. It's open source and it's nice and simple to use. A USB-B port connects it to your computer and then you can find an old floppy drive to plug in. It extracts the raw flux transitions from the drive, which means you can capture pretty much anything. PC, Amiga, PDP-11, obscure formats from old industrial equipment, it doesn't matter what's on the disk, because it's working at the magnetic and not the data and file system level. I've also got a little 3D printed case for mine just to keep it safe so it doesn't get knocked about, and I've dug out a regular old 1.44MB PC floppy drive from an old PC. The software is command line based, which is always useful for scripting. Perhaps you want to set up a batch of lots of disks to capture, but I'm using Grease Weazle GUI, which gives you a front end and then simply calls the command line tools itself. And there is other software out there that's compatible with this, but I found that this works for me. There are lots of options. We're not going to go into all of them today. I've simply chosen the option to read the disks because that's what we're up to. And I'm going to capture SCP images of the disk. So that's a flux level image. I think it stands for Supercard Pro. And I don't need to specify a format because I'm using SCP, but there are loads of options available to capture ADF, IMG, and other commonly used disk formats, which you may be familiar with. Then we put a disk in, we press launch, and away we go. One disk after another, I'm capturing the raw flux information, and if that's a readable disk, that's great. If it's got a hole in it caused by a nail driven through it by MicroProse, or a piece of cheese has fallen into the disk, that's how it's going to be archived. It doesn't care what's on the disk, it's just going to take those flux level readings. And before long, I've got an image of every single disk. What I could do now is write new disks using the Grease Weazle, but instead I'm going to try and load them up on emulators and see what works. First up then, Impossible Mission on the Amiga, which did demand the copy protection codes from the original manual, and that says something to me about its completeness. And the game works perfectly. This game was released as an ECS OCS version for the older Amigas, as well as an AGA version for the later models. And I have to say, it's a far cry from the charm of the 8-bit versions of Impossible Mission that I used to play, but this isn't a game review. The simple fact is, it works, and it seems on the face of it to be the finished game. The next thing I tried was UFO, and these discs also seem to work fine. These are the Geoscape discs with the emulation cranked up to high speed to make it a bit more playable, and I'm happily intercepting UFOs at that worldview level. When I tried to get into the action at ground level though, it threw up an error, as you can see on the screen here, and it's game over. I had exactly the same problem with the other UFO discs as well, so it could be the emulator setup, it could be the version of Kickstart I'm using or something that I need to tweak, or it could be what was on the discs. I'm not sure. I'll spend some time trying to figure that out. Obvious errors like that are easy to spot, but in some cases I think I'm going to need the help of anyone with more intimate knowledge of these particular games to spot any subtle differences. It's not like there's a big banner on them that says pre-production anywhere in the games. A disc that sadly did nothing at all was Pirates Gold CD32, which I was fascinated to see and I really wanted to see how it worked on the disc, but sadly it didn't boot, and then when I mounted it in Workbench it just showed empty. It had nothing but a few system files on it. This one has been wiped to avoid piracy. Arrgh. The Atari ST discs fared very well indeed. Rick Dangerous runs perfectly using the Steam ST emulator now, and it is as frustrating as ever to play. Some people say the ST version is the definitive version of this game, and I have no argument with that. It certainly plays extremely well. Also working is the retail rolling demo of Tower of Babel, which shows a 4-legged robot dog trotting around 3D levels, almost like a precursor to Boston Dynamics' robotic dogs. I can imagine this catching my eye in a shop window back in the day, not least because it was filled 3D polygons and it seems to move fairly smoothly. As well as the rolling demo, we had the game discs, and they too work fine. They also contained the manual-based copy protection system, which I had to get through, and I have not actually played this game before. It turns out it's a 3D puzzle game where you jump between different robots and make them work together to get through the level. The speed is a little bit pedestrian by modern standards, but I would have been impressed at the time. When it comes to the PC discs, things got a bit more interesting. I'm using the PCM emulator, which doesn't support SCP images natively. My Amiga and ST emulators did, so I had to convert the SCP images to IMG files for use with PCM. Initially, all seems fine, and I can copy the files off of the emulated floppy into my virtual hard disk. This is Stunt Car Racer we're working with, but then when I tried to run the game, it simply locked up. Gunship, on the other hand, appeared to run perfectly from the emulated disk, or at least it was completely readable and I could copy all the files across to the emulated C drive. But then when I tried to run it, it repeatedly asked me to insert the original floppy disk. I think what's happened here perhaps is that the duplicators, ZMAG, maybe they've used a physical copy protection method such as fat tracks, and that's kicked in because I've converted my SCP image to an IMG, and maybe it's lost that information. So I'd really like to try and find a PC emulator with SCP native support so I could just mount these disks. I don't know if such a thing exists. A quick search didn't show one up, but if you know of one, do let me know. If I tried the physical disk in a real PC, it did throw up a few read errors, but once I got past those, just by ignoring the errors until it had copied the files, so this disk is on its last legs, the game would then run and detect the disk, and it would let me play it. So I'm really interested to see if this would work with native support in an emulator, and it also highlights the importance that as this disk is totally about to implode given all the errors it's throwing up, the importance of being able to archive them at the flux level, circumventing any errors, and to incorporate any special copy protections and all into that image. I think we got this one just in time. F-15 Strike Eagle, it was an unreadable disk, both emulated and physically, so that one appears to have perished. As too did other discs which we didn't get to see tested there, including the Gunship 2000 disc, which was physically unreadable on a real PC as well as under emulation, and Fields of Glory on the A500 just said it was an unreadable disc physically and in our capture. So we can't save them all, but what is there and salvageable is certainly very interesting, and it is now saved. And I think it's worth archiving things like this no matter what condition they're in, whether there are processes to unpick some of the errors now or in the future. So long as we've captured them as best we can at least do something with them in the future. So what have we learned today? Well, we've learned that the Grease Weazle is an excellent piece of kit. It's well worth the money. I'm having a lot of fun using this, and it will become integral to a workshop PC that I'm building. I'll show you that when it's done. I've got a full tower case for it. It's about this big, massive PC on wheels with all the 5¼ inch drive bays you could ever dream of. This will be, I think I'll probably put this inside it, and then I can capture any discs that I want to throw at it. I might even get another one just for 5¼ inch discs. Then I can write things like discs for the Sharp X68000 and things like that. And I'll be able to keep everything running with physical media and archive off discs. And we also learned a little bit more about MicroProse. It really took me back driving to those locations, to all the games that I used to own, going out and buying them, pouring through the manuals for games like B17. And it took it from being this kind of mythical company to being a company with actual human beings working in there, you know, to see the place, to get a glimpse in that VHS rip of the people inside there, and to now have started actually meeting some of the old developers here in the cave and the customers. I say customers, people who used to dive into bins and take discs like these. Pulling all those stories together and learning about them really does make it feel more human and not just this monstrous, faceless corporate company that was MicroProse. And I really enjoyed doing that. And I hope you enjoyed looking around the buildings today too. And as usual, when I make an episode like this, I'm having a quandary about what I do with the files I've ripped. I still haven't worked out if, where and how I can safely share them with people, because there is obviously copywritten material on here. I want it to be preserved, but how do I do that without putting myself in the firing line? Or do I just put it in a safe until such time as nobody cares in a few decades? I don't know. Maybe people don't care now. It's always a hot topic of discussion when I talk about something like this. I'm just trying to keep myself out of trouble, but know that the files are safely stored in multiple places here for my own archival purposes. And if we can work out how to share that in future, we certainly will. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch. Please do share your MicroProse memories in the comments section, and take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Bit of a long episode today, but I enjoyed making it and I hope you enjoyed watching it. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.